typically
Yeah.
it's benchmark against your financial model you created when you purchased the company.
Yeah.
But then what does that mean exactly if you miss the financial return that you originally predicted? That typically it just takes you longer to get that return. That you didn't get the value as fast as you wanted to. When we look at a lot of the research compiled today, it ultimately breaks down to how well you can execute integration. That ultimately integration is the phase of the deal. Once you close and you need to integrate this organization.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. As you grow, you will be getting a lot of offers to get acquired. You might also be acquiring the companies, especially if you might not be able to meet your growth plans through organic channels. Whichever side of the M&A process you might happen to be on, you will only get value from the transaction if it is successfully executed. The most common reasons why acquisitions fail is because of the misunderstanding of the market and focusing solely on the financial models, on the spreadsheets, then really understanding what has really worked for the company that may be acquired. In today's episode, our guest, Kison Patel, shares his insights into the importance of people-focused M&A transactions and why buyers and sellers must understand the market deeply than simply relying on spreadsheet models. He also describes the success and failure rates of M&A transactions and what works for companies that have successfully executed the M&A transaction. Finally, he shares why integration is the most important step of the M&A transactions. Let me introduce Kisan to you. Kison Patel is the founder and CEO of M&A Science with a passion to drive the M&A industry forward. He was an M&A advisor for 10 years in which he sold larger companies such as commercial banks and hotel chains. In 2012, he noticed teams lacked efficient technology to manage deals and created Deal Room, an M&A lifecycle management platform. In 2016, he started the M&A Science podcast, devoting his time to creating a platform where all the best practitioners could share their best practices and lessons learned from real life deals. Kisan has created the M&A Science Academy in 2020 to offer step by step training to those looking to master M&A, featuring courses created by top level practitioners. Through developing technology, educational content, and industry training, Kisan aims to bring better practices to an industry with growing market presence, transaction values, and competition. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Kisan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sam.
Of course, my pleasure. And I am super excited to have you because the kind of M&A stories and the kind of guests you host on your podcast, it's going to be so fascinating to hear about those stories. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus?
Yeah, absolutely. In short, it's all mergers and acquisitions. I spent 10 years as an advisor,
Okay.
advising a variety of private businesses on doing acquisitions or selling their companies. And then got ideas when I noticed this trend of project management software originating from the software industry, sprouting out into other industries, was really fascinated by how software engineers would utilize these tools to manage developing software, and thought this stuff would apply really well for M&A because we have so much complexity in managing a deal end to
Y-
end.
Yeah.
And that's what led to starting a company called Deal Room in
Okay.
2012. And it was tough. Our industry moves slow, like that glacier speed. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
first 5 years were a real grind. And then Sam, I was fortunate that a friend in marketing came to me one day and said, "Hey man, you should do a podcast." And I was like, "What the hell's a podcast?" He's like, "Don't worry about it. It's gonna be the next big thing. You just got to do one." That was over 5 years ago. Started it very little expectation. I thought at the very least we can write some blog posts based on these interviews and get some marketing going. No idea that today there's over 50 podcasts that cover our sector, and we rank in the top. So we get a lot of the who's who speakers. But beyond that, that podcast has evolved into a whole media business for us, where we to date have published over 350 different assets online in all
Yeah.
different shapes and forms of long form blog posts, short form,
Yeah.
ebooks. We just published our second book, have a third one coming, the weekly newsletter that we send out. And that's what's really helped with our business quite a bit in terms of building our reputation and just creating a lot of tailwind and interest into the different product lines that we've evolved to today.
Okay, amazing. So great story there. And obviously, you are going to have a lot of stories with your journey. And obviously, your journey has been extremely fascinating. You know, what a podcast can really do for any business, right? So that's where the authority is going to be. So obviously, that is going to be super interesting to dig into. But before we do that, we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest. And that is going to be your perspective on business growth.
I always believe in, and I've been big around leadership. When I got to a point, we had 5 people in the business, and I realized I was struggling with the skills around leadership. And I think overcoming those, I remember first starting to read leadership books, didn't find the real value I was looking for, then stumbled across organizational psychology books that I found very helpful, learning about creating what drives people, motivates people, how to really connect and empathize with people, and understanding where they're coming from. I think shifting focus from pushing your own agenda and initiatives to aligning yourself and what others' goals are, and focusing on helping them achieve their goals
Yeah.
actually allows you to progress a lot further and faster than anything else. And that's part of leadership. So I think evolving with your experience and being conscious about what your driving principles are has really been helpful and made it easier to share that and start developing the leadership culture within the organization. And I think that's the ideal state, is that I'm not trying to help develop the leadership ability just in the management team, but across the organization. And so the principles I always refer to are discipline, learning pattern, and optimism. These are the key things that I really drive on to push us forward. That you need this level of discipline to push yourself to get comfortable doing the things that you're otherwise uncomfortable doing. And then I think with that, it's a learning pattern. At the end of the day, we're problem solving, and there's so much that you need to learn, be able to successfully overcome those challenges. That's a big thing. Are you consciously creating that ability? And this is where reading and things of that sort become so important, if that's a format to learn, but then also the way we interact with people. Are we spending the time, again, putting our own agenda to the side, asking the questions, really learning? Can we enter the conversation with the mindset that even though we're talking on a topic I might be a subject matter expert on, but can we put it aside and say, hey, let's assume I'm wrong or I know nothing, and really get into the conversation to learn from another person, because you
Yeah.
can learn something from everybody on this planet. And then the optimism's key. I think with the optimism, it links over to your ability to influence others. The way you can bring the energy, have big ambitious goals, be able to bring others around, ability to make people feel with see things from their perspective. I think though there's being able to get grounded on your personal principles really allows you to drive on all these other areas that you need to push growth.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for that perspective. And I completely agree. Some of the key points that you touched there, obviously, discipline and being a role model is super critical. Also, enabling others, learning from others is super critical as well. So, thank you so much for sharing that. So now it'll be really interesting to dig into some of those M&A stories, and we have been talking about this one for some time as we planned for this episode. You said that in the M&A community, and we have hosted a bunch of guests from the M&A community, and we have all sort of M&A players, and then we have businesses. Sometimes the businesses don't really know what M&A community cares for, but any business that is going to be in the market, they are going to be there to sell, right? So every business needs to be sales ready, and they need to think from the M&A perspective, the principles that M&A community is going to care for. So let's go into one of these stories that you had, and maybe if you can talk about the kind of problems that you saw when you walked into that deal and what you could be doing differently. Let's say if you were the CEO of that company, as opposed to being on the M&A side.
Yeah, I want to step back a little bit and just talk about what we're seeing changing,
Yeah.
because I think there's a view around M&A that's shifting. And one, it's broadly speaking, I mean, M&A is the largest transactions in the world.
Yeah.
When we look at any large corporation, the largest expenditures that they make are acquisitions of other organizations.
Yeah.
They are also the most complex transactions.
Yeah.
They're unique because you can't optimize M&A through a bunch of quantitative analysis. It's very much around people aligned on goals, working together.
Yeah.
And it's people to people challenges at the end of the day that you need to overcome.
Yeah.
And that's where this industry is really shifting. It's becoming much more aware and conscious about that.
Okay.
At the end of the day, it's about aligning people.
Yeah.
So now you're seeing this broad theme of finance focused M&A. We're heavily critiquing a financial model, finding ways to build a story around synergies we can capture to inflate this model till we can finally get approval to do the deal.
Yep.
And then we get the deal closed and you hand it off to another team and saying, hey, take our investment thesis and capture all this value. Good luck. And it tends to not work out. We have the fabled high 70, 80, whatever the percentage is these days, depending on which white paper you're looking at. And then that doesn't work. I mean, it's just at the end of the day, you're handing it off to the team. They're trying to do what they can to put this magnitude of change management in effect. People get frustrated. They quit their job and they take a lot of value with them. Today, the big emphasis is around creating a people-focused M&A approach.
Okay.
How do you create a higher level of transparency? You don't want a company or a person, employee that gets acquired and they're going through this level of fear, uncertainty, doubt, and then they get approached by a recruiter from the competitor, and then the story's over.
Yeah.
You want them to be aligned around, hey, there is a reason that this transaction's happening. There is, let's get aligned around this big picture and help you understand where you can fit in and be part of this. Because with this, there's typically a vision around innovation that drives most of M&A, that we're going to acquire this company to bring better products and services to the customer base, better capabilities, progress the technology faster. I think having that clarity engages the company involved. The other piece is thinking of integration very early. A lot of times we'll get the deal done, then start thinking about, okay, how do we integrate the company? Well, can we bring that end state vision to the very front end of the process so we can align CEO to CEO around what the ultimate goal is? What does that picture look like? How can we outline a go-to-market plan together so we get a sense of what's that going to look like when we put our businesses and combine them and be able to go to market? And then as you progress the process, because normally in M&A, you start a deal with very little information. And as you continue down, you acquire more and more information and it gets more complex. You get more people involved and that's where it gets complicated. Can we align around some of these early pillars in the beginning about what the goals are? And then as we continue to gather information, we'll iteratively update our plans accordingly. So now that's where all the agile theme fits in, which I'm sure comes up in your podcast. But, can we build that level of agility to be responsive as we continue to gather new information? And then again, bring the people in, make them aware about what the goals are as we continue through this process. And then when it's time to close the deal, teams are very much aligned, in the know, ready to execute. That's the ultimate goal and shift right now.
Yeah.
When we look at organizations, we're seeing a lot of these companies. So we work with a variety of companies. Most of our clients tend to be about 1 to 10 billion market cap in size.
Yeah.
And then we get some nice fun logos like Emerson, Energizer, Cardinal Health, Johnson Johnson, etc. again, same shift there. It's all going towards how do we create a more people-focused process.
Yeah.
So Emerson's a good example in terms of a company that we worked with where they are very active. They're always doing things. And in the recent news, they've had some very large transactions announced.
Yeah.
But that's also a big part of what they've been striving towards is optimizing their M&A approach to keep team members aligned as they go through the process. In terms of just walking through that scenario, it's probably a common approach. You typically want to come in and understand what their pain points and challenges are. I think understanding who the key stakeholders are, because you do need to dig for it. Sometimes it's not so obvious that there may be people of influence that are really critical.
Yeah.
And we learned that a little bit later, even in their example, that there are some real power users of the solution that we're providing weren't actually the people we're originally talking to. They sort of came out of the woodworks later when they had some feedback to share. So you go through this whole process of discovery to really understand what are the organization's pain points. I think this is the common thing I've noticed with organizations. We do a lot of marketing, so we get a lot of inbound leads that come in. And with inbound folks, you get customers that oftentimes they'll have this giant checklist of things that they're looking for in a solution. And I don't like that. I have a pet peeve with it because my head, I've seen it play out far too often where you're going to buy the product that has the most functionality that in turn is the most difficult to use that nobody's going to adopt to. And then it's going to sit and collect dust and you waste a lot of money. And we will help you. We'll go through and do a discovery, Sam, and have a conversation. Let's really dig into it. Ask the why, like kids do an infinite number of times till you're really getting into some deep things that you're uncovering. Then being able, and this is the one exercise I did with the team over there, was getting these key stakeholders after interviewing them and saying, okay, I documented and tried to get some weight on what are these key problems that you spoke about and actually got them together on a roundtable and brought them up and said, hey, as an exercise, let's prioritize these challenges. Our goal is simply create this backlog or prioritized list of what are the biggest challenges and have it in descending order and get aligned around it. And I feel that event alone creates so much alignment. It creates understanding from the different roles involved in these large transactions. And I think importantly, you just find solutions to some of these problems immediately just by putting in them front and center or surfacing them. Sometimes there could be little things that get solved earlier in the process. It becomes very obvious. Then from there, you can do some research, introduce potential solutions that typically fit in one of two buckets. It's either practice related
Yeah.
or a technology related, or sometimes both, where here's a practice we want to introduce, but the technology will help us standardize on it. And then we go through that, and that's how we start building out a solution or a tech stack that aligns with their methodology and comes in parallel with that whole life cycle to make it more optimized and efficient and create the enablement of collaboration across these team members.
Okay, amazing. So you mentioned a couple of things, and I am actually going to tell you some stories from my perspective, what I have seen in the M&A transactions that I have personally experienced. Okay, so you mentioned three things. Number one, the financial model. So obviously, you are going to have these smart MBAs from Wharton's and every single B school out there, and they are going to be involved in the transaction. And for them, the intellect is going to be really in the financial model. The second thing that you've mentioned is going to be the people-focused approach because it's all about people, right? I come more from the sales marketing side of things. In my experience, I think this is the lack of understanding of market and why anything was working for that particular company that you were trying to acquire. So I'll tell you one example and maybe two examples. Okay. So one example was, this giant company, Fortune 500, we were really giving them a hard time, basically. So they planned to acquire us because they were losing market share in the category that we were trying to commercialize. So we were at roughly what, three-ish, $4-ish million, and their market share was really declining, and we were really stealing their market share. So obviously they were threatened, and they thought, you know what, we are going to acquire them just because they have really cool product, cool methodology, or whatever. And then we are, after acquiring, then what we are going to do is we are going to combine the organization and we are going to give everybody the target of, maybe they were doing 9 and then 3, 12. So now together we'll be able to do $16 million. Okay. After the transaction, The transaction was okay. Some people left, quite natural in any of the M&A transaction. But after a year, I guess we ended up doing roughly what, 10ish. So they didn't really gain any value out of that M&A transaction.
What happened after a year? You said you're doing how much?
10 million. So they had a little
Okay.
gain just because, combined transaction, but they were still losing the market share. The real reason why this small player was winning in the market, because they were literally selling it for free. Now, you are a big company. You cannot afford to sell for free because you are trying to gain premium out of the business case that you built to your executive that I am actually going to acquire this business and I am going to give you $16 million because of this acquisition. And this is how I am actually going to retain my market share and I am going to give you more sales. So the question I'm going to ask you is, what is the real success of these M&A transactions that you have seen? Is it going to be something like what happens in the startup world, where you are counting on just one startup out of 10 transactions that you are doing? Or what is the failure rate of the M&A transactions in general?
There's a really loose term on failure rate because it depends on how you define it. Typically,
Yeah,
it's benchmark against your financial model you created when you purchased the company.
yeah.
But then what does that mean exactly if you miss the financial return that you originally predicted? That typically it just takes you longer to get that return. That you didn't get the value as fast as you wanted to. When we look at a lot of the research compiled today, it ultimately breaks down to how well you can execute integration. That ultimately integration is the phase of the deal. Once you close and you need to integrate this organization and capture those originally predicted synergies, it's the stage that determines whether you will create a significant amount of value or destroy a significant amount of value. And the startup stuff is also even more fascinating because with these companies, they have a startup culture. They're nimble, they're fast. They have developed a way of doing things that allows them to have the success that they do and build great products. And again, when that financial focus, we got to integrate this company, you end up destroying these more often than not, where you start adding these big, heavy processes, changing the way they do things, having them build more of the bureaucracy the larger company has. People don't, that's not what they signed up for. They don't want to be part of that. And then you end up getting attrition and losing people. I think that's the big part is making sure you know how you're going to integrate the company because there's obviously different depths that you could do that and making sure you're preserving what you're buying. If your big value driver is around that engineering team that's creating wonderful products, by all means, you need to do what you can to really preserve that. And then I think that the other example that you shared was around here's the expectations. I think there's also a part around that. We talked a little bit about the go-to-market planning. That if you weren't truly aligned around that go-to-market, that thinking was thought out from the beginning, and you kept iterating on it, so you stayed aligned throughout that cycle stages of the deal, you can avoid some of those fail points as well. I think there's a lot. There's a lot of science that needs to evolve in our industry.
Yeah. And in my experience, to be honest, it's always going to be the commercial understanding, the market understanding. And in my experience, again, the transactions that I have personally seen, these companies don't really understand market well enough to be able to predict whether the transaction is going to be successful or not. I'll tell you a second story. Okay. So the second story is I get a lot of hits because, when you are a podcaster, community leader, everybody's going to get hits because you are super popular from the community perspective, from the business perspective. So as you know, we are the ERP business, right? So now we get a lot of hits. Okay, people are these smart MBAs, their dads made a lot of money and they are trying to figure out, okay, how can I make money now? Okay, so obviously they have a lot of money. There's no question about that. And they don't want to do the hard work of, doing the cold calls, building the business, because that's where the real intellect is. When you actually run in the field, that's where you learn most about the business, in my experience. Okay, so these guys don't want to do that. They simply want to buy a business, and they want to buy a business that is already working well. So these guys, this super smart guy, super knowledgeable, everything was great. Okay, so this guy came to me and he was like, okay, are you willing to sell your business? And when I get these conversations, I'm always trying to learn, maybe this guy knows something that I don't know. So obviously we are not trying to sell our business, but then we get into the conversation. Okay, why do you want to buy it? If you want to buy it. And they are like, I am actually trying to buy an ERP company because ERP is really hard in terms of category. That's where money is. I said, okay. So I said, okay, what's your experience in the ERP market? have you either sold an ERP before, or has anybody in your team sold an ERP before, or do you have any understanding of the enterprise software market? And this guy says, our background is really in construction. We don't really do, I have personally not done anything related to ERP. And then I asked, okay, we are very manufacturing focused. Do you have any sort of manufacturing experience? Because construction and manufacturing, I mean, they are not same business, right? I mean, when you are doing these
Right.
deals, even the micro slices could be very different. The way market moves, the way market powers, forces move in the industry. This guy said no. Then I said, okay, so now tell me, why do you believe that you will be able to increase the value of this business that I am not able to do? And that's the insight that I was trying to get from him, because I would like to do that myself. So he has some ideas, but I could clearly sense that he had zero understanding of the business, because he has never either sold or touched, ERP business in any capacity. I tried to coach him. The ERP industry is very different. Stay away from it. It's very competitive. It's you will not be successful in it, and you are probably going to lose your money. So this is my story about any of the people who are simply analyzing a business on a spreadsheet and they don't really understand what is happening in the field. So what would you say to these guys who are really transacting? And I have tons and tons and tons of stories like
Yeah, I mean, it's just right there is a recipe for failure. There is a learning curve to M&A. There's definitely a learning curve to it that I would definitely want to do something large to start with. I would really assess your risk and know that there are going to be things that you're going to learn that are going to cost you a lot of money to learn. I would definitely keep that in mind that there's maturity cycle that you go through as you develop your M&A muscle in your organization. It's not a simple thing to go through. Definitely a lot of trials and tribulations to really get there. And every company has it. Some of it's just unavoidable, no matter how much you try to prep or even using external resources. It's not as the same as developing your own capabilities. But I think that's the big thing is being conscious about it. But then if you can leverage folks that are experienced that can help you expand the thinking about some of those things, like in the example, there's a lot of the strategy components that really need to be fleshed out. And we see that a lot. I'm going to buy this company because it's a shiny thing. And it should be mapped against a well thought out strategy that you should have that really crystallized. And then you can go and use M&A as a tool against the strategy. But you don't do it the other way around. Look at the opportunity, then figure out the strategy. That's not the way to really do M&A properly.
Okay, so maybe you can share some of your stories now. So what's been your successes, the successes that you have seen? What was the right secret sauce for the success there versus maybe a failure story? And, I mean, maybe it is around people. Do you have any stories that you might be able to share?
A lot of this I always see is just the culture. If you can create, if it's a team that's a very change oriented team, that's success right there. I feel like it's hard for them to fail. If there's somebody that's proactively trying new things, they're whether they're open about, hey, let's try this new tool, let's try these new techniques. They're just a hungry team that's motivated to try just to be adaptive. Those teams are highly successful. I think if I were to break that down in my just experience, that's a commonality I've seen. A lot of the large organizations where folks have been in the roles for a decade plus, I think it's a lot more difficult to introduce that level of change. That's just a common thing about these firms that we've worked with. It's always the common element. Do they have a change oriented culture? Whether it's investment banking, private equity, corporate development, that's what it stemmed down to. And I don't want to generalize and say, oh, we've always find more success with the smaller teams because they can less people easier to realign them, but not the case. There's some large organizations that they've gotten to that point where they've embraced it and made change part of their culture. I think that's the biggest thing. I don't know if you've came across that in terms of how do you enable that? Because I feel like half of the stuff that we're trying to implement isn't so much just here's the technology to make the change. And obviously the technology's got use cases, right? Here's a workflow that you're currently doing. And most of the time in our sector, Sam, our day to day, it's always where's Excel? Because wherever we see Excel, we see a lot of inefficiencies and
Yeah.
problems that stem from it. So let's find out where in your process we see Excel and how that's managing the workflow. And then we build around that and say, okay, let's look at using a project management type of workflow and things of that sort. But, beyond that, it just goes back to that. Are people gonna adapt to that new technology? And I think the thing that we've learned with trying to encourage companies to develop that change-oriented culture, it all stems with giving a compelling reason on why adopt a new tool or new practice. I think that's the thing that needs to be driven hard for it to work well, is that you do a very proper discovery. That's a whole capability of its own. The real art of being able to create the depth in the conversation, get a couple levels deep to get the sense of understanding from the other person's perspective, that being able to articulate the challenges in their words. That the better you do that and you got that real story and narrative around it. I'm trying to think of a good problem as an example that we've recently encountered. A lot of the times, and this is probably a frequent one that comes up, we hear the term "herding the cats" a lot. When you do M&A, you're going to have to do diligence and integration planning,
Yep.
and because it's sort of an organization wide transaction that you're really buying the whole company, and with that you're getting a variety of people in your organization involved, even as an acquirer, to really make sure we know what we're getting into, do a findings report, do some preparation for how the integration is going to happen, but really understand what are the risks and opportunities. That the problem, the challenge with doing that is oftentimes it's through functional leaders, right? Got my IT leader, marketing leader, sales leader, legal team leader, HR leader, across the functions. They need to go in, be able to do this assessment, but they need to avoid working in silos, because when these team members work in silos, now it becomes more of a checkboxing activity than the real out of the box thinking. When you can enable this level of collaboration, that's the big thing that we've been realizing, that here's the problem, that these folks are working in silos. You're fighting for their full-time efforts that they're doing running their function. So hey, you have that full capacity that you need. Is there attention there? And really aligning them to put that level of effort into this transaction to make sure everything's covered, the details are really managed and acted on. That's tough. That's really, really hard to do. And there's typically somebody in a corporate development team that's responsible for it. And what we found is just doing it manually, doing it through email, Excel. Is there a way to create a tool that allows you to have visibility across these functional leaders, so now they can share their findings with each other in real time? And this conversation happens so that when you have these weekly check-in meetings to report in, it's not team members that are learning things for the first time or too busy thinking about what they're going to tell the group to listen to what others are saying. A lot of those conversations already happen. People are in the where because of the leveraging a tool to distribute the information more efficiently. Now you get into a meeting and it's very direct. It's like, okay, we know this is something that we came across. How we're going to address this risk and really make it more productive. Here's this problem with the functional leads actually being able to coordinate with each other during a transaction, and that's what ends up happening is, if you're going down, I'm trying to think of a company right now that we just recently worked with, and this is like a real common one, to be honest with you. That one, Halo Trading is a good one. They buy a lot of the branded so companies, if you buy your own branded logo wear, things like that, they're one of the largest at doing that. They're constantly acquiring other businesses that do that same thing. But that's like a common one. When we worked with them, that was the big thing, that they didn't have any kind of centralization. Everybody would go off, do these diligence report, and it was completely disconnected. And you're depending on one person to constantly chase people around
Yep.
and say, okay, did you do this? Did you do that? And that was the fun, was working with their team to say, okay, here's the same problem. Everybody's working off in silos, but can you really enable a team that isn't working together in the same room? They're off independently, but allow them to work more cohesively to start connecting the dots. And now IT, or we got like HR comes across something where they noticed, hey, there's a big drop off, or full time people are getting replaced by contractors. And then finance noticed, well, we noticed like payroll's going up significantly. Then it's sort of, hey, how do we connect the dots and understand
Yeah.
what's going on there? Is
Yeah.
that something we need to be concerned about? Are they having turnover issues? Things like that. But that's just one example. The other big one, even given that same example there, was handoff between the process of doing diligence and actually integrating the company, where there was a big disconnect. When there is a disconnect, You bring in a new team and saying, hey, your job is to execute on this half-baked plan that we created and be able to capture this value in this newly acquired company. What often ends up happening is that team will then go back and do diligence again on the deal. Now you just created like a duplicative effort that you did diligence once to assess if we're going to buy the deal. Now we're going to do diligence again to really figure out how we're going to integrate the company. And that's again, can we create this project management workflow out of a single database so that we can repurpose all this information we've already gathered? And it's funny as it sounds, but it's happened so much where a deal gets done, it's managed on Excel trackers.
Yeah.
And they're setting up, our industry uses these products called virtual data rooms. Are you familiar with a virtual data room?
Yeah.
So this is basically Dropbox with some additional security functionality. It's usually got watermarking, audit trail, and very granular permissions. Well, back in the old days, and you got to be mindful that this industry went from physical data rooms where you actually had physical rooms with the security person you checked in with.
Yeah.
And you would go and pull down your banker boxes and go through a bunch of data and financials. These companies actually would come to your office and scan documents and put them on servers.
Yeah.
And with that, they would bill you for every single page they scanned. It was a per page model. 2021, they're still doing it. They're still the major providers, Interlinks, DataSite, are still billing out per page. And that's what a common tool that's still used in the industry. But you end up with that silo information problem because here's the key data and artifacts related to the transaction that are stored in that secure environment. But then you're using this Excel tracker to manage all the back and forth where as you go through and do diligence and even integration, you're continuously asking for information and requesting it, then following up with clarification questions. You're doing that hundreds of times. So that workflow becomes pretty cumbersome doing it on Excel and then having to. So after the deal closes, most of the time you archive all that data. I think we finally moved from actual CDs to flash drives or just doing a bulk download. And then you offload it and that data actually gets lost. The team that originated the deal and the lawyers get a copy, but then the folks oftentimes that execute the integration, the value creating activities, they don't even have access to that data. And then they go back to the company and they're essentially requesting all that information again. And now you're creating a lot of frustration for that team that just went through this exhilarating, exhausting effort to go through the transaction, get worn down and distracted from that whole process of answering all these diligence requests. Now they got to go through this integration phase and they're getting a lot of redundancy of those requests again, which again, you're causing more headaches and frustration that's rather unnecessary.
Yeah, so that's it for today. Do you have any last-minute closing thoughts or remarks for our listeners?
I think the theme we touched on, you can develop a change-oriented culture and do that through a compelling reason why. Spend the time to do these qualitative one-on-one interviews focused on understanding the roles in your project or organization, particularly in M&A in this case. Really flesh out what are those challenges and use that to be drivers to implement change.
Okay, and my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be an M&A integration is definitely going to be far more than just your financial model or the model built on the spreadsheet. So make sure you are doing the due diligence and really working with people to make sure your integration is going to be successful. On that note, Kison, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a powerful episode.
Hey, thank you for having me, Sam. I enjoyed the conversation.
Of course.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Kison, head over to mascience.com. It's mascience.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Nick Jackson from Mendota Group, who discusses what lifestyle brands can do to enhance their value for strategic buyers. Also, the interview with Damon Pistolka from Exit Your Way, who discusses why word of mouth or traditional marketing strategies are no longer enough for business growth. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.